Good morning again, everyone, and again, welcome to the JRG WebEd series for March. Today our topic, and it's a pretty hot topic, I think, we're talking about repeal and replace. And of course, we're referencing the Affordable Care Act. So before we get started, and again, we wanted to go ahead and start in appreciation of everybody's time. As a reminder, we will be sending out a copy of the PowerPoint and recording to all JRG clients who are participating today. And also, we want to go ahead and thank all of our members of our partners who are participating, all of the clients who are members of these different partners of ours. We really appreciate your participation, and we hope that you are finding these webinars, again, educational, informational, and helpful. So, the key focus of President Trump's campaign was repealing and replacing the ACA. We heard it day after day. So during our time today as we meet, we want to go back in time a little bit and really do a broad overview of the Affordable Care Act. Then we're going to go ahead and look at some of the proposals that have been introduced so far, including the most recently issued American Health Care Plan. And then also we want to look at what has occurred in the first 6 weeks of Trump's administration. Basically, we really want to look at what have the regulatory agencies been doing since President Trump has been inaugurated. And then finally, we want to look at what you need to do to stay the course. Since the ACA remains to be the law of the land until it's at least repealed and probably replaced, we have to, again, stay on course. However, what comes in the future regarding health care, be it sooner or later, the challenge is that any law in its final form will have to address these challenges. How to expand health insurance, increase the quality of medical outcomes, and continuing rising health care costs. No matter what party you're affiliated with, that has been also the main issues that both parties want to look at when it relates to health care. So let's start at a brief ACA overview. And first of all, how did it affect employers? So just as a short reminder, just think in 2 short weeks, on March 23rd in 2010, that was when the Affordable Care Act was passed. So we're going to have a 7-year anniversary coming up here in a couple weeks. And how it affected the employers, first of all, it really affected every employer because it instituted what we call the health insurance mandate. Basically, every group health plan was required to have preventive services, dependent coverage to age 26, no pre-existing condition, clinical trials, patient protections, and that's just a handful of the mandates. Another thing that affected employers is that if you were a large employer, over 50 or more employees, you no longer have the ability to define who you call a full-time employee and who you offered coverage to. The ACA told you it's someone who has 30 hours of service, and you have to offer coverage that is minimum value, it's minimum essential coverage, and affordable. And you also had to offer it to their dependents. Or if you didn't, you could be penalized. When we look at individuals, we know that every U.S. citizen was subject to a penalty if we didn't go ahead and maintain health care coverage. However, to ease that bite a little bit, the ACA did provide subsidies that those certain individuals, if you met certain criteria, you could go ahead and receive coverage on the exchange. We know that Medicare and Medicaid were also affected by the Affordable Care Act. There was Medicaid expansion into almost every single state. Medicare, again, the way that people were paid or Advantage plans were definitely changed. Believe it or not, it's considered to be healthcare cost savings. And these savings, one way they were implemented is that for a fully insured plan, if the insurer did not meet certain administrative thresholds, meaning if their cost exceeded a threshold, then money had to be rebated back to the employer and eventually was rebated back to the employee. Now, in the beginning, there was a lot of rebates. They were called medical loss ratio rebates. And there seemed to be a lot of that going on. However, in the last, I'd say 3 years, that has really dwindled down as insurers have really got a much more tighter rein on their administrative cost. Also, as to a savings, it was considered the patient-centered research center that was created and that we pay a tax for. to go ahead and research what kind of care would be best for certain diseases or illnesses or things that happen. So again, that was deemed to be considered a cost saving. And then finally, the ACA, it was implemented for government revenue. We had the mandates that were implemented. We had the tanning tax that had a 10% increase. I have to admit I didn't get to use that one. There were taxes on medical devices, increased Medicare taxes. If someone makes more than $200,000, they pay 0.09% more on their Medicare taxes. There were fees which required. We called the DCORI fee, that Patient-Centered Research Institute tax. We had a transitional reinsurance fee that was implemented to help reinsure the insurers on the exchange. And again, if you were self-insured, you were actually writing the checks for these. So although the mantra of repeal and replace has been loud and clear, for it to happen, it's a lot easier said than it's done. So let's look at some of the different phases that could go on or that are going on. So in order to replace, the law would actually need to be repealed. Now, the process for getting something repealed, it would have to go through the House of Representatives. And we know as we sit today that would be possible because the Republicans have enough votes in the House to go ahead and pass a repealing. However, once we get into the Senate requires a 60 vote that required to go ahead and pass any type of legislation. So a repeal would require 60 votes. And the Republicans have 52 votes. So they wouldn't be able to really pass the muster. And by not having all the votes, what that would mean is that there could be a filibuster in the Senate. And a filibuster, as we all know, is the opportunity for someone to take the floor and maintain that floor as long as they can keep on speaking. So again, the repeal and replace together, it's a much higher hurdle to jump than it's realized. Another approach that could be taken is just repealing, or at least part of it. And this would be through a process called the budget reconciliation. Now, the key thing about budget reconciliation is that the senators and the congressmen can go ahead and take and pick apart different provisions and repeal them just based on that provision. However, what you need to know is that provision has to go ahead and it has to affect somehow revenue. It either has to affect spending or, again, revenue that comes into the country. For a budget reconciliation, there's only 51 votes that are required, and a budget reconciliation is filibuster-proof. So that would also probably be easy to get, but not guaranteed. So if we're talking about what would affect revenue or spending, we would be looking at issues at the employer and individual mandates, revenue generating, the Cadillac tax, revenue generating, and other taxes established under the ACA. So while the budget reconciliation is not really in a repeal, it's actually, you're defunding the program. So it's considered a de facto repeal. And next we have replacing. Now replacing the ACA will require, again, a proposed act. And whenever a senator or a representative proposes legislation, there is a process that has to go through. And we're actually going through this process now. We're going to talk about that in a couple of slides. So what happens is a senator or a representative introduces their bill. It then will go to a committee. The committee says, we think this will be good. Let's take this out. And then it has to go through a markup process. A markup process means we extend our committee and we let others look at it and say, take that out, red line this, or put this in. And then it also has to go through, it's called the Congressional Budget Committee, and they have to score it. And by scoring it, we mean they look at it and they say, if you keep these provisions in here, it will cost the country, the United States, this much money to go ahead and implement these things. So again, to say we're going to just go ahead and repeal or replace ACA, again, it's a much longer and harder process than it's realized. Finally, let's talk about maybe just repairing the ACA. Now, with repairing, you would get bipartisan support because what we would do is keep some key provisions that many like, both sides, and then we would get rid of some of the unpopular provisions, again, that both sides don't like, and then we would go ahead and develop new laws. So that's your brief civic lesson for today. So what we want to do in the next few slides is go over some of the highlights of some of the proposals to replace the Affordable Care Act to date. Now, we're not going to be lingering on each of these proposals in detail, especially since there are a lot of similarities in the various proposals. The common threads are repealing parts, keeping parts, and disagreeing on other parts. Now, generally, it's agreed that the employer and individual mandates need to be eliminated. I think that is, except for the Democrats, but in Republicans, I think that's an agreed upon issue. Next, there are many of the health insurance mandates it's thought that should remain. Everyone really seems to like the coverage to age 26. They like the clinical trials and preventive services. But one that they really do like are these no pre-existing conditions. However, in some of the proposals, we're going to see that there's getting to be a spin on the pre-existing condition. They're talking about saying, let's kind of return the pre-existing condition and having those certificates of credible coverage, but we're going to put some caveats on it. And we're going to talk about one of the plans that contain that issue in several slides. A modified return to pre-existing condition, as I just mentioned, again, we would also talk about that credible coverage. Now, another commonality is the amending of the HSA rules. Some of the reports that I've been reading that health savings accounts, they are becoming more popular with employers and with employees. And what most of the proposals are looking at are saying, let's expand them. Let's go ahead and have individuals be able to put more money into those accounts so they can cover their medical expenses. Also, let's go back to some older days. Let them be able to go ahead and reimburse over-the-counter drugs from those HSAs. Excuse me. So other things that we're looking for solutions, and the regulators or the congressmen who are putting together these proposals, they really are looking for solutions other than just employers offering the coverage. So again, they are including things like tax credits or tax incentive for individual policies. And then they're also looking at, they believe is a big selling point, is individuals being able to go ahead and purchase coverage across state lines. So our proposals to date, we're going to look at the 2015 Reconciliation Bill, Patient Freedom Act, A Better Way Act, which was introduced by Speaker Ryan, Empowering Patients First, which was introduced by our current Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tom Price, the Republican Policy Brief, and the American Health Care Act. So the 2015 Reconciliation Bill, this was actually introduced back in 2015 by now current Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tom Price. And what this bill was, it was meant to repeal the ACA key features. This bill was previously passed in the House and the Senate. However, then President Obama did veto it in 2016. However, this bill is really now said to be the foundation on which Republicans are looking at as the future legislation for repealing and replacing the ACA. Another interesting fact about this bill is that all of these provisions were previously approved by the Senate parliamentarian as being budget related. So again, it's a reconciliation bill. It has to affect either spending or revenue. And the parliamentarian said yes, these were all affected. All these issues did affect spending and revenue. So the presumption is, since the parliamentarian already said we could proceed under reconciliation, the presumption is we could continue to proceed. Just for a little bit of background, the Senate parliamentarian, he's the one who basically says, hey, these are the Roberts rules we have to follow. These are the processes. And he basically keeps all the senators in line. The Patient Freedom Act, it was introduced by Senators Casey of Louisiana and Collins of Maine, and it was just done this past January. Now, the Patient Freedom Act, it would serve as a replacement for the Affordable Care Act, as it would keep many of the consumer protections under the health insurance mandate. Now, the key differentiator with this act is that it would allow states to select the form of healthcare regulations they want to implement for their residents. So in giving the state flexibilities, the states could say, hey, we love the ACA coverage, that's what we want to keep. Or the state could say, oh, we really want to go back to the market-based system, but however, give us some federally funded money, and we're talking about instituting or implementing Roth HSAs to go ahead and do that funding. The funding, it would include refundable tax credits, and then again, either a state, there could be either state or federal administrators for that. And then finally, the state would have flexibility in saying, you know what, we want to go on our own. We're not looking for federal funding. We know what's best for our residents. We'll create our own plan. The Patient Freedom Act, it also has a lot of transparency in it. It's very big on saying, you know, let's limit the out-of-network emergency services, limit the cost of prescription drugs provided by out-of-network hospitals, and then actually having the providers provide the prices for their services so that an individual or consumer could say, wow, if I go over to this hospital, it's going to cost me a lot more than if I would go to the other hospital. Another interesting thing under the Patient Freedom Act, it talks about auto-enroll, saying that residents of states would automatically be enrolled in health care coverage, and if they would have the right to disenroll if they want to. So again, different issues out there that are being raised by some of the senators. As to Speaker Ryan's plan, which is considered a better way, the principle of the Ryan plan are repeal the Affordable Care Act, provide Americans with choice, lower the cost, raise flexibility, protect our vulnerable citizens, basically our sick and our elderly, and protect and preserve Medicare. Now, what I just said really is nothing shattering here, because this is what the Republicans have been stating, repeatedly stating, during the last 7 or 8 years of the Obama administration. Now, the theme of Ryan's plan really aligns with President Trump's ideas on health care. They look to trust in free markets, rely on individual responsibility, and have a shift from federal government to state government as to the provision of care. So again, looking at some of his things, that what Ryan introduced, improving, expanding health savings accounts, he is really for no pre-existing condition exclusions. They should be prohibited. I think one of the key things that it mentions here is, it talks about a refundable tax credit for those Americans not eligible for employer-sponsored health coverage. Why I think that's important is because he mentions refundable. However, he does not mention an advanceable tax credit. And why we really want to look at advanceable tax credits is because we have to recognize every U.S. citizen cannot pull $500 or $600 out of their pocket to pay an insurance carrier every month, so they may need those tax credits. So if they're advanceable, they would get that money ahead of time. So I think that is going to be a key issue with the Ryan plan. Again, looking at not only refundable tax credits, but making sure that they are advanceable. When we look at Secretary Tom Price's plan, his is called Empowering Patients First. Again, he also mentioned that refundable tax credit. I think there might be an issue there. He talks about cost-sharing subsidies to certain individuals. To me, that draws my attention because remember, under the Affordable Care Act, when we talk about subsidies, we generally talk about premium subsidies, although there also is a cost-sharing subsidy. So unless this was just something that wasn't completely thought out, if we would only be talking about cost-sharing subsidies, those would only be subsidies for co-pays, co-insurance, or deductibles. What about the premiums? So again, not sure if that was an oversight on Secretary Price's part there. He also likes expanding and improving those HSAs, selling coverage across the state lines. And continuing with our proposals to date, let's look at what's called the Republican policy brief. Now we know on February 16th, Republican leaders in the House issued the outline of a plan to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. And how they introduced it was in the form of this policy brief. There was no legislative text, and there was actually no Congressional Budget Office scoring that I had previously mentioned. So some of the things that the policy brief outlined, they would eliminate the employer and individual mandate, not by actually repealing the law, but by zeroing out the associated penalties. So basically it would say, yeah, you're required to offer coverage or you're required to have coverage, but if you don't have it, there's a zero penalty. So again, it's basically a de facto repeal. Again, talking about permitting the health savings accounts, expanding maximum contributions. I think an interesting aspect is permitting same account contribution for catch-ups. Currently, if you are married, each spouse has to have their own HSA if they're over 55 and want to have a catch-up. However, what this would do is would say, geez, one spouse could put a catch-up into another spouse's HSA. Again, they talk about returning that the use for the over-the-counter healthcare items. My issue I see here is where they talk about capping the current employee tax exclusion. Now, under current law, the amount that an employer expends for employee health coverage, as well as the contribution the employee makes, is excluded from the employee's taxable wages. This is known as the employee tax exclusion. Because this exclusion is scored as a federal revenue loss, the IRS can't collect money on this because, again, it's pre-tax. Under the policy brief, a cap has been proposed on the exclusion. So the cost of health coverage that exceeds the cap would then be taxable income to the employee. I think, again, this is a big issue that is probably going to have a lot of debate going on. I think in comparison, you want to look at the Cadillac tax. Now, the Cadillac tax also would be a tax on an excess high plan. So if you have a high benefit plan and it costs a lot of money, if it passes the threshold, you would be taxed on the excess of the threshold. The key is, under the Cadillac tax, either the employer or the insurer is taxed. However, under the employee tax cap, it is the employee is taxed. So we're really just looking at a cost shifting here. However, we also want to recognize if the employee's healthcare contribution or healthcare is capped, so will the employer be affected. And this is because if the employee cannot pay for it on a pre-tax basis, they have to pay on it post-tax, this will also increase the employer's contribution for FICA taxes. And it would also affect employers as to the deduction that they would be able to take as a business expense for the provision of health care. So again, some key issues we have going on with this capping that employee tax exclusion. And then finally, nothing has been spoken about how do we pay for this. You know, we're talking about a lot of expense that could be created, but we've not talked about how we can pay for it. The next issue we wanted to address was the President's congressional address. We know it was February 27th that President Trump gave his first address to a joint session of Congress, and he repeated his desire to repeal and replace the ACA, and he echoed many of the proposals already presented. However, he most strongly favors Speaker Ryan's plan. So I just put a couple quotes here. He wants to talk about ensuring that Americans with pre-existing conditions have access to coverage. We want that stable transition for Americans currently enrolled in healthcare exchanges. I think this point was made because he recognizes if we would just take away all the subsidies, we would destabilize the marketplace today. It would be an implosion, basically. And then finally, he stated that we want to ensure that we help Americans to purchase their own coverage through the use of tax credits and health savings accounts. So again, this is where he's showing that he's favoring expanding those HSAs. He also had mentioned about giving tax credits that would be age adjusted. So the older you are as an American, probably the more tax credit that you would be able to get. Another thing that he mentioned in his speech is tort reform. Now, tort reform has been talked about for years up on the Hill between employers, between attorneys, and just every U.S. citizen, I think. And President Trump mentioned about placing limits on the amount that hospitals and doctors would have to pay in settlements for medical malpractice lawsuits. Now, however, this was not addressed in the policy brief that we just recently talked about. Another thing that President Trump mentioned, he talked about reductions in artificially high price of drugs. And we know we've experienced that throughout the last couple of years. Finally, the American Health Care Act. This was actually just released this past week on Monday, March 6th. And it was actually unveiled in two parts by the House Ways and Means Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee. Now, the Ways and Means Committees, it was basically, it was the repeal portion. Repeal the taxes, repeal the different mandates. The Energy and Commerce, it was a replace portion. So basically what they really talk about were dismantling the ACA taxes, eliminating the individual and employer mandates, prohibiting health insurers from denying coverage, keeping that dependent age to 26. However, we notice under the American Health Care Act, if you look about the fourth bullet down here, we're now talking about an advanceable refundable tax credit. Again, I thought that was a key issue only because getting someone who can't afford their health care coverage, waiting till they get a refund from their income tax may be just too late for them. So again, that advanceable issue is a key issue. When we talked about age-based, we talked about there could possibly be tax credits from between $2,000 up to $14,000. Increasing HSAs. Personally, I like this increase. Right now we know that an individual can contribute $3,400 to an HSA, where if you have family coverage, you can contribute $6,750. The American Health Care Act would increase those contributions up to $65.50 for an individual and $13,100 for a family. And again, we keep coming back to this pre-existing conditions, and they keep saying, but, you know, we want to keep pre-existing conditions, but we want to go ahead and maybe put some caveats on it. And the caveat they're talking about is that, yes, pre-existing conditions would not be imposed upon a person, with the exception that if you did not keep continuous coverage for a particular part of time, and they're looking back to the old HIPAA days when you couldn't have a break in coverage of 63 days, that's what they're looking back again. And if you do have that break in coverage, then you could be subject to a premium surcharge of 30% on your coverage. And that 30% would be applicable for the 12 months under which pre-existing conditions could be imposed. So this to me looks like this is kind of the fix as to the individual mandate. Because again, it's not saying you have to have insurance, but what it's saying is if you don't have insurance and then you have something that's been around for a while or a previous condition, you will be paying some type of, again, penalty on it. So now the next couple of slides we're going to talk about what's happened already. So as everyone is aware, President Trump issued, basically on his first day in office, he issued the first of many to come executive orders. So first what we want to discuss is what is an executive order? Basically, it's an official statement from the President about how the federal agencies he oversees are to use their resources. It is not and should not be the President creating new law or appropriating new money from the Treasury. It's the President instructing the government how it is to work within the parameters that were set by Congress and our Constitution. So this first executive order that he gave, and again it was issued on January 20th, it directed the various agencies to exercise their authority to delay any outstanding implementations of the Affordable Care Act that would impose a cost, a fee, or a penalty. So basically, this is not a repeal, and it may not even be a delay. It's basically non-enforcement. So it said, use your authority to say that you don't have to enforce a certain provision that is out there now instead of implementing a new one. And then President Trump, on actually January 30th, issued his second executive order, and it affects employers who offer employee benefit plans. Because this order directed that for any new regulation that's proposed, 2 must be repealed. It's kind of like a reverse BOGO. Instead of buying one and getting one free, he's saying if you're going to go ahead and give me a new regulation, you have to take 2 old regulations away. So again, it says that this order directs that any new regulation proposed, 2 must be repealed, and also it must achieve a 0 net cost impact of all regulatory actions. So what does that mean? This 0 net cost impact, it refers to whenever a regulatory agency puts out a regulation, what it has to do is it has to do a study as to how it would affect, how the cost would affect those affected by it. And basically for employee benefits, we're talking about employers. So for example, let's say, okay, we're going to put in this new reporting requirement. It would take employers 15 hours to do this. So that means they would have to have a person who would be paid $20 an hour, and that's what a cost analysis is. So what President Trump is saying, if you're going to put out a new regulation, I want a 0 cost impact. It will not cost the employer anything to implement that. So continuing with the regulatory and agency actions or non-actions, the IRS was the first to step up to the plate and say, we're going to comply with what the President said as his executive order. And what they did is they basically stated that for individual tax returns, a return would not be rejected due to failure to provide information about having health care coverage under the individual mandate. So we know that when we file our Form 1040, we're supposed to mark on there, did we have health care coverage or did we not have it? If we didn't, we're supposed to pay a penalty. Previously, if the IRS would have received that 1040 and one of those boxes was not checked, it would reject the return and you would have to refile. However, so what the IRS has said is if they receive it and the box isn't checked, it's not going to be rejected. They will go ahead and still work with the filing. Now, what's important to remember here, that doesn't say that you won't be assessed a penalty or not. It's just saying that your filing will be accepted. And also, this IRS action, it had nothing to do with the reporting under the 1095C and 1095B requirements. Also, another agency that stepped up to the plate based on President Trump's orders was the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS. And what they did is they published guidance relating to the Affordable Care Act by issuing proposed rules to promote more continuous coverage of individuals, which would help stabilize the marketplace exchange. And it would also improve the risk pool. And what their guidance proposed is shortening the enrollment period for the exchange and requiring pre-enrollment verification for special enrollment periods. I think what they have seen happen is that many individuals are still saying, I'm not going to have coverage, I'll jump onto the exchange when I need it, and I'm going to tell them, oh yeah, it was because of a special enrollment, I lost coverage, and if no one's checking, they go on and they get that coverage and jump off again. So now what they're looking at, and this is supposed to be implemented as of 2017, that there would be a pre-verification of a special enrollment period as to that qualifying event that permits an individual to go ahead and get the exchange coverage. As an employer, you need to be cautious of this because that would be something you would have to verify if it's a group health plan. And continuing what's happened already, as to the regulatory agencies, some other agency actions. The IRS issued a memorandum concerning the tax treatment of fixed indemnity plans. Now, if you're not aware, a fixed indemnity plan is one that pays a fixed dollar amount for health-related events, such as I have to go to the hospital, I have a surgery, I'm going to be in there for 5 days, so I will get $100 a day for every day that I'm in the hospital. Or it might be a fixed payment for a certain medical condition, such as cancer or arthritis or heart disease. Now, the IRS provided that if the coverage for this indemnity that you would be receiving was paid on a pre-tax basis, then when the benefit is received, it becomes taxable income to the employee. What the employer, or you as employer, would need to do, you would then have to add imputed income to the employee based on the amount of that benefit. Failure to do so actually results in underreporting by you because you have underreported the employee's income, and also you have underpaid your employer payroll taxes, which again is a tax liability to you. The memorandum also addressed wellness programs. It clarifies that an incentive or other benefit under a wellness program is excludable from an employee's income only if it pays for or reimburses qualifying medical care. And the IRS is particularly looking at some different wellness programs out there that are being sold because they're being marketed as wellness programs when they really are just a structure to go ahead and use the savings to pay for voluntary benefits. So basically what it's saying is, here we have this wellness program, you can pay for it on a pre-tax basis. And then if you complete a health reimbursement, not a health reimbursement, a health risk assessment, excuse me, that will give you $100. Memory lapse there, sorry about that. We would give you $100, an indemnity. Or maybe if you have a health screening, you'd get $75. So what the IRS has said, this is basically, it's just a way to go ahead and kind of double dip to pay for this benefit on a pre-tax and then go and receive cash for it when you're not receiving really health care on it. So, you know, you need to be careful of that, and you need to keep an eye out open for that. Also, we do know, and it's already passed, that the IRS did give a 30-day extension for the 1095-Cs to be provided to full-time employees. They were supposed to go out as of January 31st. It was extended to March 2nd, which that deadline is now passed. What I thought was interesting about this extension is they said you don't have to give the form to the employee until March 2nd. However, if you were filing by paper, you still had to report to the IRS by February 28th. So a little bit of, again, an overlap there. So let's move on to what you should be on the lookout for. And again, just, excuse me, as a reminder, these are, I'm giving a caveat here that none of these are set in stone. Right now we're going through a very volatile time as to our Congress looking at the Affordable Care Act, what they want to repeal, what they want to replace, the whole thing. So you may be hearing on the news every day different aspects of it until it goes through both the houses. Remember, we have a bicameral institute, and it is signed by the President that the Affordable Care Act is still the law, and that any of the things that we're proposing, they're just things that you need to be looking for because they could happen, not they will happen. So the individual mandate, again, the purpose is to ensure that every American has coverage or they have availability to be covered or is covered. So taking away the subsidies, already previously mentioned, it would really cause a destabilization of the insurance market. So it shouldn't be a surprise if many of the ACA requirements have a phased-in approach. And when we talked about the American Health Care Act, that's really what it talks about, a lot of things. It talks about things being implemented as of 2018, 2020, not an immediate action. And an example of that, they talk about repealing the tax credit by 2020, not 2017. Also, one of the things that are being considered is to go ahead and talk about having younger people get coverage. They're not talking about changing that age rating from a 3-to-1 ratio to a 5-to-1 ratio. Steps are also being taken such that there will be that we talked about the pre-verification of special enrollment eligibility. Again, it was mentioned instead of it being a penalty for not having coverage, there could be a premium surcharge if you don't keep continuous coverage. We're not sure what the amount of time is yet, and that then if you have a pre-existing condition, it would be imposed for at least 12 months. One thing I wanted to talk a little bit about here is the market reform mandates. Will they stay or will they go, or should they stay? And the one that I have highlighted here is the essential health benefits. Now, we know that under essential health benefits, there are 10 of them. It's hospitalization, pregnancy, drugs, habilitative service, rehabilitative services, oral and, dental and vision care for children. So these are all specifically spelled out and enumerated in the Affordable Care Act. And it really would require a change in the law to eliminate entire categories or even to water them down. So there is a possibility, as we're looking at proposals and new proposals are coming out, that there could be regulatory change that could skinny up these requirements. The one that they're talking about the most basically are the maternity, the habilitative services, and again, the oral and vision care for kids. When we talk about also the tax subsidy being replaced by a tax credit, it mentioned if you don't have qualifying health care. Now they're defining qualifying health care as being governmental coverage, Medicaid, Medicare, or a CHIP program. Or also qualifying health care would be an employer health plan. As I've been reading through some of these different proposals, I try to watch out for some of the words that are being used. And when I looked at when it said having qualifying health care, in one proposal it talked about having access to the care. In one proposal it talked about being offered the care. And then one said having the care. So those words are important because having access doesn't mean having coverage. So would you get the tax credit if you don't have the coverage even though you had access? Again, things that we have to wait for that will need to be spelled out in any final legislation. Next, be on the lookout, the employer mandate and ACA reporting. Most of us probably never thought, or at least I didn't think, that when referring to health care coverage, we would start out by saying, in the old days, or the good old days, well, that is probably where we may be returning, because right now, many of the things that we're looking at are going back to pre-2009 plans. Days when an employer determined who could be eligible for their benefits and what contributions that the employer thought could be affordable. So we need to be, also, so there would be no more concern about what kind of plan do I have? Do I have a bronze plan or a gold plan? Those metallic plans would probably be disbanded. Also, it's key to remember, if the ACA requirements are going away, that there are still many compliance requirements that have been put in place pre-ACA that still need to be met. ERISA has been around for 40-some years now, 1974. I don't think ERISA is going anywhere. COBRA has been around since 1985. I think it's going to be staying intact. And especially as we start looking at these subsidies, COBRA may gain another importance that it had previously. Some other things that we have to be careful with as to, ACA reporting or just other mandates. We talked about other laws, non-discrimination for self-insured plans. It's called Section 105, non-discriminate. You can't discriminate in favor of highly compensated employees. That's still out there. You still need to comply with that. Be aware of it. Your non-discrimination testing for your cafeteria plans. Remember, you can't discriminate in favor of highly compensated as to eligibility, benefits, or contributions. The other aspect we have to look at, insurers may still have requirements. They may still have that if you're going to offer our plan, you have to offer it to at least 50% of your full-time employees, or at least 50% have to be covered, or you may have to contribute 50% of the cost. So there are still other issues, not just the ACA mandates or ACA reporting that has to be met. There are other laws and also other insurer requirements. After the 1095B and C and the 1094B and C, that reporting, I don't think it's going away. It may be relaxed somewhat, and only because as most of the proposals keep talking about a tax credit, well, someone's going to have to follow that, track it, and then report on it. So we already have the vehicle in place based on our 1095C reporting. So I think that's going to stay around because it will be a vehicle that could be used as to, again, tracking and reporting on tax credits. Also be on the lookout, employer payment plans and health reimbursement account designs. Now we know back in 2013, the IRS told us that you cannot have an employer payment plan that would pay for an individual policy of an employee, and that if you had an HRA, it could not be standalone. It had to be integrated with that other group health plan. So we might want to go ahead and watch to see what kind of guidance will be coming down the pike as to our HRAs. Now we already know that based on the Cures Act, it has tried to give some relief to smaller employers as to go ahead and being able to provide for individual plans. The Cures Act does permit standalone HRAs for small employer. A small employer is one that has less than 50 or more full-time equivalent employees in the preceding calendar year. Some of the issues, though, under the Cure Act and what it creates is called a qualified small employer health reimbursement arrangement. And these QSHRAs, you have to be careful because if you're going to offer the standalone HRA, although you can pay for individual policies, you cannot offer any other coverage. So as an employer, you can't say, well, for my executives and my managers, I'm going to go get that great PPO plan, but then for everybody else, I'm going to have that standalone HRA. There can be no other health coverage offered. There are some notice requirements when you offer this type of HRA that must be met. You have to inform the employee that if they do get a premium subsidy because they've gone to the exchange, that may be affected by the money that you give them in the HRA. So again, keep your eyes out, and the question has to be, will this be continued such that large employers can go back to offering also standalone HRAs? Be on the lookout for health flexible spending accounts. Again, some of the proposals that we talked about today, they talk about removing that index cap of $2,500. So will that go back? And if it does go back, will they also say, since you now can put more money into that FSA, we're not worried about a carryover amount because you don't need that $500 carryover anymore. So how will that be impacted? And also, what about the reimbursement of those over-the-counter drugs? Will that come back such that you can take that out of your health flexible spending account? And also, if the Cadillac tax remains intact, it stays as part of our law, or whatever law is going to become in the future, will FSAs be a part of that tax? So if you have an FSA and you're putting $5,000 into that, could you possibly be taxed on that? Which would take away the reason for having an FSA. Also, wellness rules. Remember, wellness rules have been around for a while, and that an employer can offer an incentive to an employee for participating in a wellness, and previously, an employer could provide a 20% incentive. And we know the ACA increased that cap from 32% to almost 50% if you include a smoker cessation program. So if we take away the ACA, are we going to also take away this increased incentive under wellness programs? We'll have to see what the regulators want to do on that. Also, as to wellness programs, we know that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission just issued, it was in 2015, the final rules as to how wellness plans are affected by the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. It also imposes a 30% cap on incentives. However, the caps under HIPAA wellness incentives and the EOC wellness incentives, they don't really coordinate. Now, we know that right now the EOC wellness program requirements, they're not favored by a lot of the representatives that we have. So I think there probably will be a change on that, but again, we need to keep our eye on it and see what's going to happen. So stay on course. Affordable Care Act is still the law. Applicable large employers continue to offer that minimum essential coverage, that's minimum value, affordable to your full-time employee. A full-time employee is one who has on average 30 hours of service a week. Don't forget, you have to offer to dependents also. Document that offer. Continue to track your employees to see if they are full-time employees. Remember, you have that look-back measurement period or your monthly measurement period. So you're going to be tracking when the employee's hired, the hours they work, the offer of the coverage, the terms of the coverage, the cost. Remember, you have to observe those tax reporting and payments. Our PCORI fee, also known as that CER fee, it's due in July. If you are self-insured, you have to go ahead and report that as an employer. If you have a health reimbursement arrangement, that is also a self-insured plan that has to be reported in July. Employers, if you have 250 or more employees that you reported on W-2s last year, remember, you have to include employer-sponsored coverage on that W-2. Stay on top of changes. Discuss with your leadership. You know, as I said, this is a volatile environment that we're in right now as to employee benefits. So when you hear one thing, everything that you heard on today, you can't go back to your leadership and say, this is what's going to happen. These things could happen. We have a process. Our government has a process it has to go through, and we are part of that process. The key thing is, remember, if you measure to be an applicable large employer in 2016, you must comply with the ACA as of January 1, 2017. So don't forget that look back to see what size employer you were. Also, it's real easy to say, you know what, there's not going to be enforcement, I don't have to worry about it, no penalties. You also have to remember that if you're a private employer, you are subject to ERISA. And under ERISA, there's a provision that says, as an employer who sponsors a plan, you must comply with all federal laws, or that will be deemed a violation of ERISA. So just to get another reminder, the ACA is a federal law. So stay on course, your disclosures. Remember, we talked about ERISA, COBRA. You have a lot of disclosures and notices are required under these laws. Maintain those documents, distribute the documents and notices. Remember, changes to benefits means changes to documents. You need to have a resource who can assist you with those changes. Your amendments, your summary of material modifications. Know your budget and how it's going to, how it will be affected due to changes. Again, if they would lower the health care coverage expense deduction, how would that affect you? How's that going to affect your budget? What about increased FICA taxes if something goes through? So with that being said, we have come to the end of our WebEd seminar today on Repeal and Replace, the ACA. And we want to go ahead and remind you that our next WebEd event is Thursday, April 13th, and it's going to be on Benefits Administration Platforms. We will go ahead and open up to any questions that we have. And as a reminder, when we sent out the invitations, we had said if you have any advanced questions that you want to send in, please do so. And we did have one person send in a question. And the question was, Let me see. How are age-based healthcare rates not discriminatory? So I believe the questionnaire is asking, so if we're a small employer and we have to do age banding for our employees, how is that not discriminatory? Now, the answer, it gets to be a little involved, so please bear with me. And the first and shortest answer, unfortunately, is because the regulatory agency who has oversight of these rules, which is the Department of Health and Human Services, basically said so. They issued guidance which provided that a plan will not be discriminatory due to premiums being different based on age because of age banding. Now, the little bit longer answer on that is, or the background, is that the Department of Health and Human Services really more than likely turned to the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and said, give us some oversight as to the Age Discrimination in Employment Act and how you look at discrimination based on age. And what the EEOC probably said was that when you're considering age discrimination related to employee benefits, basically health benefits, life benefits, that there is really a benefit and cost analysis that needs to be performed to see if it is discriminatory. In a summary, what benefits and cost analysis really does is says, okay, here's the benefit, and here's what it would cost if we give it to a 25-year-old. Here's what that benefit costs if we give it to a 35-year-old, and you go on and on. So if it is proportionate or such that if the cost is going up because it's just costing more to provide the benefit because of age, then that's not deemed discrimination. So again, kind of a long answer to that, but that is why age banding is not considered discriminatory.
We do have another question. The first question is, this was very thorough and informative. Thank you. If we need to talk with you one-on-one, how do I contact you?
Basically, on our last slide, we do have provided the information for JRG. If you would like to reach out to us for either our brokerage, consulting, or compliance services, you can contact the 1-800 number. And if you would like to speak to me then, they would go ahead and transfer the call. So thanks so much for asking that question. Any other questions? Well, if there are no other questions, again, I want to thank you for participating today. I hope you did find this informational. We will be staying on top of any type of legislation that comes out on this. We're looking at it daily, what's going on the Hill as to your representatives, all of our representatives, and what they're doing. Again, don't forget our next presentation on April 13th, which is going to be on benefits administration platforms. Thanks so much and have a great day today.